Hello everyone and welcome back to LycanhoodReads. I'm coming at you here in December, at the end of 2022, with some end of the year videos. First off, starting with most disappointing reads of the year. I wanted to start with the most disappointing and then work my way up to the best books I read this year, just because I'd rather get the negative stuff over with and then be more positive ending out the year. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So unfortunately, the first book on my list today is House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. This is a fairly new release. I believe it came out at the beginning of November or the end of October. And I snatched it up just as soon as it came out because I was super excited about it. I thought that the cover had so many good vibes going for it, and I was really just looking for something, even after Halloween, I was just looking for some sort of spooky, sapphic, preferably, vampire situation, and this book just sounded like it was going to hit on every level for me. Unfortunately, that was not the case. So I ended up reading House of Hunger on audiobook not long after it came out, and unfortunately, I did not love it. I did read the whole thing, and I won't go so far as to say that I didn't enjoy parts of it, but there was definitely some disappointment just from the overall premise being presented as a very vampire-y thing, and then the actual execution was a little more vampire-esque, and kind of vampire-adjacent. I don't want to go into too many details or give any spoilers away because, like I said, the book is fairly new, and I know that some people are really enjoying it despite the fact that it didn't meet my expectations. But I will just say, if you're going into it, don't go into it expecting actual vampires. That's not what you're going to get, and that's what happened to me. I went in expecting some good vampire stuff, and what I got was watered down vampire stuff. Not quite vampire stuff. Just sort of rein in your expectations on that front. There is a lot of bloodletting and actual blood drinking, and there are some supernatural elements to this novel. However, I think to go so far as to call it vampires is not quite right. It's a little misleading, or at least I felt misled. And I just ended up not really loving the overall plot or the main character very much. So in general, this book fell just a little bit flat for me, which is unfortunate because I understand that a lot of other people are enjoying it. And if it had been what I was expecting, it would have been great for the fall season, but alas, moving right along. My second most disappointing read of 2022 is a little bit of a throwback to the beginning of the year. It's a book that I got from NetGalley called Silk Fire. And so at the time I was reading it, it had not been released yet. And I was super excited about it based on the description. It had a really long synopsis description come with it, and it was just naming all these different amazing elements. It was kind of naming all these different elements and kind of throwing all of these different vibes and elements against the wall, telling you that it's going to have dragons, it's going to have dinosaurs, it's going to have polyamory and political intrigue and revolution and just a whole laundry list of things, right? And that definitely got me hyped. I was like, man, this book is going to be packed full. It's going to be an explosion of just some awesome fantasy, sci-fi, hybrid stuff. It looked like a lot of different stuff that we hadn't seen, or that I hadn't seen at least, in fantasy or sci-fi. And so I was just super hyped for it. And so I got my copy from NetGalley, like an ebook, and I really got into it. I was reading it. The writing rubbed me the wrong way from the very beginning. From the first paragraph, the first chapter, I was having issues with the prose, because it's one of those fantasy or sci-fi fantasy novels that is throwing a lot of terms at you right away. So a lot of place names, a lot of people names, a lot of just sort of world-specific vocabulary that in that first chapter you have no idea what it is or what they're talking about. And so it's just a lot all at once, super visceral, and you're just mostly confused. And it goes on like that for a little while before they start to explain any of it, any of the world building. Overall, I just felt like the world building for the book was really not fleshed out quite right. You spend most of it being kind of confused about a lot of things. And this book had a lot of problems, not just the world building. The pacing in particular was pretty difficult. Like I said, it sort of busts out of the gate at full tilt, and then it does slow down a little bit towards the middle, where I actually started to enjoy it. We started getting a lot of character stuff, a lot of character dynamic stuff, and I did enjoy some of that, but the pacing's just thrown off again around chapter, I believe it was 16. It's been a while since I read it, but around about halfway through the book, there's this big sort of climactic event, and after that, everything goes full tilt. Again, it's just full speed ahead in a breakneck way that's not in a not good way. And it was really hard to keep up with what was going on and everyone's motivations. And the main character was constantly wishy-washying back and forth with their decisions, so it was hard to understand where they were coming from. And none of those elements that were all like listed out in an exciting way in the synopsis were well fleshed out in this book. Everything about it just felt very rushed and very sort of under-edited, I guess is a good way to put it. And even though it has an amazing cover and it had some really cool ideas going for it, and of course I was excited to see this polyamorous relationship, or at least this sort of polyamorous dynamic that was happening, it just didn't get enough time, and it was just buried under all this craziness that the rest of the book was trying to do. And I think it ended up just being one of those situations where the author was trying to do way too much, way too fast, and it all just ended up feeling too chaotic for me to enjoy personally. I wrote a pretty extensive review for NetGalley and on Goodreads, so of course I'll link those in the description if you're interested in some more in-depth thoughts on Silkfire. Next is one that I feel a little bit guilty including on this list, but I put it on here nonetheless, and that would be Bluebird. That is a sci-fi book that came out this year, a sapphic sci-fi kind of space opera-y thing that I was pretty excited about from the very beginning of the year, and when I finally got to read it around, I think, August, it just ended up falling pretty flat for me. I read it on audiobook, but the narration was fine. I thought that the performance, was good, but the book itself just felt like every other sci-fi book, or should I say every other space opera book that I've read in the last few years. It just really wasn't bringing anything new to the table. It wasn't really setting its characters apart as much as I would have liked to see from just sort of the sea of space opera characters. The world was a little bit cut and paste from this, it's like a corporate run, space opera world where the corporations are the enemy and they control everyone and you're on the run from them and fighting them. It's the same thing. It just felt like the same thing that I've read a lot recently, but I've seen it done better or just in ways that I felt more and more engaging. And I feel bad that I didn't enjoy it because it wasn't doing anything wrong. It was doing a lot of the same things that other books of the same ilk have been doing, just not as well in my opinion. There were a couple of elements that I enjoyed, particularly the love interest is a librarian in this world. And the librarians are a little bit different from in our modern society. They are put like up on this sort of pedestal, almost like priests. And it's not a religion, but it feels almost religious the way that people honor them and sort of venerate them. And their like collection of knowledge and their research and archiving and all that stuff, it's held to a high regard and is given a lot of respect in this particular sci-fi universe. And I thought that was pretty cool and an element that was underexplored in this novel. Honestly, if the author wanted to continue exploring this world or these characters in future books, I would probably check that out because I think there was potential to this first book, or there was potential to the world building and to the characters, but we just didn't get to see any of it in this first sort of generic sci-fi adventure. So yeah, sorry Bluebird, but I was pretty disappointed after about 8 months of hype. So next is going to be Primal Animals, and this is a sort of YA sapphic horror release from earlier this year. Again, this is one that I got from NetGalley, so I read it a little bit early, and it just it sounded so cool. So it's this girl, she's being haunted by something, as most horror protagonists are. And she is shipped off to this sort of college prep summer camp, her junior or senior year of high school, or summer of high school. And she meets a girl there that she likes, and her mother was a legacy at this camp, sort of a big deal. So she went to this camp when she was a kid, and kind of was maybe a bully or like a mean girl. We're not really sure. That's part of the mystery that's unfolding throughout the book. And I had a lot of hopes for this book. I was like, a horror book set at a summer camp where there is going to be a sapphic romance? Yes, sign me up. I was super excited. But it just ended up falling flat in a lot of ways. I felt like the book, or I felt like the author wasn't really sure what they wanted to do in terms of what they had to say with this particular kind of horror. It's a psychological sort of body horror, but there's also some cult elements involved. And I didn't know what I was supposed to be feeling about the events that were unfolding. And the ending ended up being a little abrupt, not quite tying it together as much as I would have liked, and just sort of leaving a lot of loose ends that I would have liked to follow through with. In terms of the sapphic romance elements, it is very weak. It's just, we don't get a lot of time with the love interest, I didn't feel like, or like with the love interest and the main character kind of spending time alone together. I didn't feel like I got to know them very well. They were just a little shallow, kind of two-dimensional. And the romance just doesn't take up much space in the overall plot of the book for it to be a really satisfying element. Overall, I just was pretty disappointed with this one. It is a quick read though, and there are certainly the summer camp horror vibes there if that's what you're looking for. I just feel like this book had a lot of potential and it didn't meet that, which is the case with a lot of the books on this list. Alright, moving right along is Nothing But the Blackened Teeth from Cassandra Khaw. I am having a hard time with this author in general. I'll talk a little bit later about I DNF'd one of her novels this year as well. But this is the novella that I read before that, so this is the first thing I read by her, and I was pretty excited about it. The cover is so cool. Love the cover. I believe it has a sequel, but I don't think I'm going to be reading it. The sequel to the cover is also really cool. And this is a novella, so I try to be a little more forgiving with novellas just because such a short format, there's only so much you can do, there's only so much you can pack in there. And this one just didn't do it for me. I definitely enjoyed the atmosphere that the author created around this sort of haunted Japanese mansion or villa thing that they were at. And I was super intrigued by the characters' histories and the character dynamics that were at play within the group in this haunted, situation. I could feel that there was a lot of tension and a lot of history between the characters that we didn't really get to explore as much as I would have liked. In fact, if the book had focused more so on the character dynamics and the character history and all of this trauma that they were obviously trying to ignore, I would have probably enjoyed it more, because it kind of builds all of that stuff up throughout most of the novella, and then the haunting just takes over the plot at some point, and then it's just a bunch of kind of trippy, crazy stuff that we get rushed through at the end of it, and we never come back to all that delicious character stuff that was happening at the beginning. And I was like, I really wanted to know more about that than this ghost, even though this ghost it seems kind of cool, but like, what are we doing with the ghost exactly? What are we saying about these characters? What do you want me to know about this ghost and how it's affecting the people that are being haunted right now? And I didn't feel like that the novella followed through with a lot of the good build-up that it had in the beginning. So, yeah, pretty disappointed. Next is going to be The Expert Systems Champion and The Expert Systems Brother by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And let me tell you, I am so sorry to see Mr. Tchaikovsky on my list here. But these are two sci-fi novellas, or sort of sci-fi fantasy hybrid novellas from Adrian Tchaikovsky. It's a duology. They're both fairly short. I read them back to back on audiobook, and they just sort of weren't much, I guess. They were a little middle of the road. It's definitely not what I've come to expect from Adrian Tchaikovsky, who has become one of my favorite authors, definitely one of my favorite sci-fi authors. And so I, picked these up, and it didn't feel like him. It wasn't what I had come to expect from him. It takes place in this fantasy world that is made up of these very tiny communities that are extremely isolated from one another, and when someone gets exiled for whatever reason from one of these communities, it's pretty much a death sentence because they can't survive out in the world on their own, and other communities are not likely to take them in if they know that they've been exiled from another. So the brother in this sibling dynamic gets exiled, and we deal with the consequences of that, because he gets exiled for reasons that are kind of out of his control. I don't really think that he deserved it, but it's about what happens in the wake of that and how his exile kind of leads to a lot of questions about their world and the way that their world functions. And there's some timey-wimey, sci-fi-y stuff as well later on, but I don't want to spoil anything. I just wasn't... These novellas just weren't what I was hoping for, especially from Tchaikovsky, and I actually had a hard time finishing them. The only reason I was able to finish is because they were so short and because they were on audiobook. And I think this next one is going to be a pretty unpopular opinion, but I finally got around to reading Gearbreakers, which is, of course, that YA dystopian mecha sci-fi book that's sapphic. So it's about two girls on sort of the opposite side of this mecha war, who, of course, enemies to lovers and whatnot. And there was a lot of hype surrounding this book. I don't remember when it came out, but I've been hearing about it on BookTube for a long time. Finally tried it on audiobook, and I didn't love it. It's hard to say why, but I know that one part of it is that one of the narrators, I believe it had two narrators, one for each of the main characters, and one of the narrators' voice just was rubbing me the wrong way. And I feel like anyone that's read some audiobooks knows that can just instantly be a no-go if something about the narrator's voice isn't working for you. And I don't mean that as an insult to the narrators. Like, it just sort of individually, sometimes it depends on the book, sometimes it just depends on the reader, but, like, sometimes a voice is just doing something that you can't listen to a lot of. And even though I did manage to finish the book, that was definitely part of why I didn't enjoy it too much. I found it pretty distracting. But beyond that, I just felt like I wasn't really getting to know the characters very well. They both felt kind of surface level and like very petulant, especially the one that is a Gearbreaker. She felt very petulant and just angry all the time, like she sort of had this one mode all the time, or this one way of speaking. And I didn't feel like I got to know either of them very well. I also didn't feel like I got to know the side characters very well either. And the world, even though we spend a significant amount of time doing some world building, it just felt kind of copy and paste sci-fi world to me. It's a similar problem I had with Bluebird, where I just wasn't feeling any individuality or any originality to the world. And I just felt like they was just kind of a copy and paste sci-fi background. So yeah, I didn't love Gearbreakers. I may give the second book a try just because, but no promises. This one wasn't great for me. Next is going to be The Light from Uncommon Stars. Now, I was super disappointed that I didn't enjoy this book as much as I would like. I won't go so far to say that I didn't enjoy it or that it's not good. I think there are parts of it that are good, but I think there are parts of it that are trying to be too quirky, if that's even possible. One of the main things that this book is compared to is A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I think while that comparison is fair to the vibe that the author was obviously trying to go for, I just think that the absurdity sometimes of what was happening got me a little lost. That made it sort of hard for me to keep up with what was happening, but more importantly, with what the characters were feeling or what the characters were trying to do or trying to accomplish. There were a lot of queer elements to this book, which I did enjoy. I enjoyed the romance between the donut lady and the demon lady. I enjoyed the queer main character, the trans main character. I didn't feel like I ever got to know them as well as I needed to really fully enjoy this book and to really fully enjoy this story. I don't want to go out saying that this is one of the worst books of 2020. That's not true, but it was a bit of a disappointment for me because I ended up not liking it nearly as much as I had originally hoped, just based off the premise and sort of what it was being compared to. And because I think this idea of like a queer kind of Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy-esque absurdity would be great, but you gotta know when to rein it in. And if I don't feel attached to your characters, or if I'm not really understanding where the story is going or where their motivations are going, then it's not working, right? Something's not working. All right, and next is going to be Icebreaker. This is a queer male-male romance YA novel about hockey. So that sounded, fantastic. I wanted to check this out. I think the cover is great. It gave me a little bit of vibes from the All the King's Men series. I think that's what it's called. I'll put it up on the screen. But I thought it would be a lot like this, you know, sports romance sounded fantastic, sort of rivals romance, rivals to lovers. And it was all of those things, that's true. But once again, like a lot of books on this list, it just ended up falling a little flat. The book felt a tad bit short to me. I felt like it could have been longer, in which case I could have gotten to know both main characters a lot better and kind of been rooting for their love story a little bit more wholeheartedly, I guess. I've read a lot of YA romances, and at this point I've read a lot of queer YA romances, and I know that they can be really powerful sometimes. Or they can be really fun, or they can be a combination of both. And this one was just sort of neither. It was just a little forgettable for me. It wasn't super powerful, didn't make me feel a lot, and it had some fun elements, but it wasn't a good time. So I just, even though I had high hopes for this one, and I thought it was going to be this great, you know, queer YA romance, sports romance, that I just didn't love it. Okay, these next two are going to be the two books that I ended up DNFing this year. DNFing as in I started them, got a significant way through, and ultimately decided to stop reading. And at this time, I don't feel like I'm going to be picking them up again. That's sort of how I define DNF, rather than just a book that I have started but haven't finished, there are several of those this year as well. But these two, I don't think I'm going to continue. We'll see. You know, things change, but... The first of which might be a little controversial, and that's going to be Fevered Star by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is, of course, the second book, her sequel to Midnight Sun, and I just couldn't. I don't know how much I read of it. I was reading it on audiobook, and I got a significant way through. I don't know the exact percentage, but it might have been just below halfway, if not halfway, and I couldn't do it. So I really enjoyed Black Sun. I did. I thought the world that Rebecca Roanhorse introduced us to in that book was fascinating and was just super exciting to see a world based more so on like the America's sort of mythology rather than, you know, Eastern Europe or even Asian mythology. We're getting a lot of that too. I hadn't read much from a sort of South or North American mythology perspective, and I was super excited to see that. I was enjoying it in that first book. And then, you know, everything blows up at the end of the first book, and I didn't know what to expect going into the sequel. And like, as the sequel wore on, there were parts of it that I just wasn't following very well. I was like, who is this character? Why am I supposed to care about them? I've kind of forgotten why I need to care about them. And then, of course, my main reason for enjoying the first book is the mermaid character, the bisexual pirate captain. I was super excited about her. I loved her in the first book. But she is falling in love with... Serapido, I think is how you say his name. And I kind of hate him. So that's unfortunate. I know a lot of people love him. He's some people's like the highlight of their reading experience with this series, but that is not the case for me. I don't care for him at all. And the fact that my favorite character was like falling in love with him, and she got a little obsessed with him in this second book. Like, everything about her character arc in the part of this book that I read, at least, is her trying to find him and like worrying about him and wondering about him, and everything about what she's doing is about him. And I found that really hard to enjoy. So I don't know how it played out. Obviously I haven't finished it, but I just wasn't enjoying it. I don't know, maybe I can come back to this series again one day, maybe when the series is complete and I know a little bit more about where it's going in terms of the character development and just like how much we're exploring that world, because I am still super interested and curious about this world that Rebecca built. I think it sounds incredible, and I think there's so much potential there, and I'd like to go along for the ride. But for now, at this time, I'm not going to finish Fevered Star, and we'll just see how things change in the future. The next DNF is the one that I mentioned a little bit earlier. It's a novel by Cassandra Khaw, and it is called The All-Consuming World. Now, this was one of my most anticipated books, I think of 2020, because I think it came out at the end of 2020. But anyway, I was super excited about this one even before it came out. The cover looks amazing, and the way that the synopsis sells it as sort of a queer female you know, space opera revolution sort of thing, like this old gang of criminals getting together again to fix the mistakes of their one last job sort of deal. And that sounded right up my alley. I was all over that. And then I get into the book and it's just hard it's hard to enjoy it. I was reading this one on physical. It's one of the few books I read physically this year, or tried to read. I didn't finish it. But the prose, like the way that it's written, is so disjointed and very fast. And a lot of times I didn't understand what was happening, like during conversations or when things were going on. I'm just like, I'm not following the thread of the motion of this book. I'm not following the threads. I'm not understanding it. I was definitely having a hard time. I was struggling. This book just sort of rubbed me the wrong way, honestly. A lot of the things that the characters were saying, the way that they were speaking with each other, and how their dynamics were sort of unfolding were confusing to me. And it wasn't what I expected it to be. And in the end, I DNF'd it. I'm not almost halfway through. It's not a very long book. Almost halfway through. One of the major elements of this book is something called age ships, and I still to this day don't know what those are. So it's something that they kept talking about throughout when I was reading, and I just wanted to know like what those were and what they looked like, and the book never wanted to describe them to me in a way that was satisfactory. So around where I quit, I'll say that one of the characters is at this concert, or it sounds sort of like a concert, or like this very large gathering of people. And we run into one of these things, one of these age ships in the crowd at the concert. And we're talking to it. We're having a conversation. And I was so confused because I thought these age ships were supposed to be massive space vessels or something, like whales, like the size of whales, space creatures. I mean, just what I'm saying right now should get the point across that I didn't have a good grasp on what these things even were. And so I was picturing something massive and huge, and now we're talking to it in the middle of this concert, and that, like, nothing was computing for me with this book, and ultimately I DNF'd it. I don't think I'll be going back to finish it, because after having read a couple of things by Cassandra Khaw at this point, I'm not really sure that they're for me. Not to say I won't try something in the future, or even finish this in the future. We'll have to see. It is fairly short, but at the time, I just couldn't force myself through it, so. Alright, that's going to wrap it up. Those are my most disappointing reads of 2022. I hope that some of you guys maybe enjoyed these better than I did. If so, I would love to hear what you liked about them in the comments. If you have any questions about more details about what I was having issues with any of these, just let me know. I'd be happy to discuss. But next, we're going to hop on into the best books of 2022.